Right, in my last video about how much I dislike Germans, I got actually quite a few comments from, I guess he's a subscriber. I didn't really notice him commenting on my videos before, but his name is Mr. Kemyan. Apparently he's from Austria, which I didn't realize I had any Austrian subscribers. And he largely agreed with my analysis, if not my reading of the title of the book. And one of the reasons I made the video is to kind of look for to isolate things that I think might be causes or variables that affect the libertarianism of given populations, because I think it's obvious, at least anecdotally, that there are differences between how amenable different societies are to libertarianism, and specifically that Americans, at least relative to other Europeans and certainly other Western Europeans, are much more amenable to libertarianism than, it seems to be that way. Now, I admit that there are difficulties in scientifically proving that, because most of the differences, I think, are going to be qualitative and not quantitative, and it makes it very hard to really prove anything. But I'm glad to see that it's not just me who sees the differences, and there are more. I mean, I outlined free speech, gun control, and education. Really, I could have said religion. Germany bans certain religions like Scientology. Obviously, I don't like Scientology, but that's not how you deal with things. And when I bring it up, other Germans will defend the prosecution of that. Obviously, this is kind of related to the free speech, but all of the very draconian so-called, I think they have a name, like honoring the dead or something like that, but the anti-Holocaust denial speech. I mean, another one of my subscribers asked me what I thought about the whole gas chambers or whatever, and I said, well, as far as I'm concerned, it's a moot point, because what we do know for sure, the whole slave camps and the war itself would be mass homicide on a giant scale. So whether they had gas chambers as well or not is, I mean, it's like if you know someone committed a murder, it doesn't make a lot of sense to argue ad nauseum whether or not they committed sodomistic necrophilia on the corpse, because the murder is, there's a crime there. However we want to deal with the crime, that's the main thing. Whether they did anything more, I mean, I guess it's an interesting question. But anyway, that's illegal. And I actually, I remember having lunch with a Frenchman once, and he said, even if you go and you say, well, I want to research World War II, and I want to estimate how many Jews were killed, and you come up with like 5.5 million as opposed to 6, which is the official number, that's a crime. And when I asked him about free speech, he said, what about it? There's no pretense that there's even supposed to be free speech. That's not an accepted, liberty at all. And I thought it was weird too, because France, why would France care? France wasn't supposedly guilty of the Holocaust. France has done lots of other things, but not that. But anyway, Mr. Kemyan kind of asked, well, I don't remember exactly what he said. It's interesting to look at maybe what other causes are, and this is something I've thought about for a long time. And I mean, I don't know that this has been explicitly studied. There's one book by an American about Canada called Deference to Authority: The Case for Canada, which I did a video on, called Deference of Authority: The Case for America, a couple months ago. And I heard, I don't know if it's in Mein Kampf, but I know Hitler said it somewhere, that he basically thought, well, Americans are only a certain type of person. The immigration to the United States wasn't random. It's not like the way it worked is just big swaths of European society that, had all the characteristics of European society were scooped up and sent to America. Since almost all of the Europeans were immigrants, voluntary immigrants, they were self-selecting, And it's reasonable to guess, to postulate that maybe certain traits were selected for. Maybe not always the same traits. Maybe when Polish or Irish people were coming, there was a different kind of selection process than when the original English colonies were coming. But I will say, those founding English colonies, especially the one in Massachusetts, but also the one in Jamestown, we call them Englishmen, and they were definitely from England, but they represented an extremely rare type of Englishman. The Puritans, not everybody in England was a Puritan. They were theocratic. I mean, we don't want to pretend like the United States has always been a libertarian. In fact, Massachusetts Bay Colony, I think, in some ways, is one of the most theocratic societies that has ever existed. I mean, they were imprisoning and actually torturing people for doing things like kissing their wife in public, or dancing, or having brass candlesticks as opposed to wooden ones. But it was a very, very hyper literate society, and I mean, there comes a point where you can say, well, there's a cross section of English society, and the Puritans are a part of that. But if you take and you just have the Puritans leave, or the Quakers are another big influence. The average Englishman is not any kind of Anabaptist. They're not a Quaker. They come to America, and you have a whole society that sprouts just from that one permutation of the society, and it really becomes a whole different society, or at least it has the potential to be. And Mr. Kemian said that he's heard of genetic research. I have not heard of any genetic research. He's saying that there's some evidence that Americans are more adventurous or anti-authoritarian. I haven't seen anything hard science that would show that, but anecdotally it may be true, and it would make sense. I mean, if you take the whatever people are willing to leave the European society and come to the United States, what are they going to do is they're going to have kids with other like-minded immigrants, and they're going to raise their children in a society that is, I mean, just think about it today. So we all agree that Americans aren't totally libertarian, but if, let's say, you took the most libertarian 1% of the population, and then they all got together and formed Galt's Gulch or whatever, I think it's not hard to imagine that would be a significantly different society. The makeup of the individuals would be different, and as a result, the society is going to be different as well. Now, I don't know how consistently or what traits were being selected for when the immigration was happening. Like I said, I'm going to guess that the traits actually varied and changed. I also think sociologists would find this really interesting too, because I think a certain type of socioeconomic person, regardless of genetic makeup, was likely to come. So someone, the Junkers or the aristocracy, the feudal lords, it wouldn't have made much sense for people like that to immigrate. It always would have been lower class people who had more to gain and less to lose by leaving. It's not always the case. If you look at someone like William Penn, like I mentioned, the Quakers, a lot of the Quakers were actually very, very wealthy and powerful merchants. So maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe that's part of it, though, a whole bunch of merchants and whatever. And when we talk about freedom of religion and freedom of speech, even though Quakers are pretty rare now, there is a very, very strong influence with the idea of freedom of conscience. That whether you go to heaven or not, you can't be coerced into. You can't be forced to convert to Christianity. You got to persuade people, and it's just the only way around it. So you can't have a state religion, and of course we don't have a state religion in the United States, and that's why, even though Germany and England have state religions, they have pathetic religious communities relative to the United States, because we have a free market in religion. I mean, if we had a free market in everything else, we'd be all set. But so there's all the genetic variables. I think that there's the nature versus nurture debate, and you just think, even if you had a pair of identical twins, say one of them's born in I don't know, Plymouth or Southampton in 1750, and another one's born in Oh, it would have been some kind of agricultural town, a small town, in say Pennsylvania, or on the Susquehanna or the Delaware River, maybe in upstate New York or something. Not necessarily right on the frontier, getting attacked by Mohawks all the time. Actually, there were almost no conflicts with the Mohawks, but some of the Algonquins or something. Even if they are identical twins, they would have extremely different upbringings and in very different circumstances. And one variable here, I think here that has been really neglected is the interaction with the Native Americans or the Indians. There's a lot of study of the effect that Europeans had on the Native American societies, and obviously it was immense because the majority of them, they speak English now, they dress like Westerners, other than maybe a strange surname and ponytails, they're not, or braids, they don't seem all that different. And so it's easy to say, hey, look, that's the cultural exchange definitely went that way, but it was definitely not a one-way street. And if you really look, and especially at the Indians in the Northeast, especially the Algonquins and also the Iroquois, they had a really strong impact, I think, on the society of North America. The other Indians less so, because when they were encountered later, they were, in absolute and relative terms, far less influential. If you look the first 150 years about up until the American Revolution, and it may perhaps even a little bit after, maybe going all the way to Tecumseh in the War of 1812, the Native Americans, the Indians, had a fairly profound influence, a major impact on the society. If you look, although this isn't true in, say, Mexico or maybe debatably in other parts of the southern United States, they were basically anarchists. They didn't have states. You'll hear about the Iroquois Lodge and the Six Nations, and there's a lot of imputing of European norms on Native American social structures. So people imagine a chief is kind of like a king. This is almost never true, and even in the places where they're a bit more authoritarian, like say the Powhatan or the Pamunkey, or maybe to a lesser extent like the Illinois, even there it's debatable. Most of the chiefs, you take a chief like Pontiac, for instance, who was a very powerful chief, he doesn't have the power to coerce other Indians, at least in any kind of formal legislative way. He might literally personally coerce an Indian, like he might tomahawk somebody who didn't do what he said, but he didn't have a legal authority to say, okay, everyone in the tribe has to go and do this. He could lead by example. If he was a successful and revered chief, they might follow him, but he couldn't order them to do this. And there's a lot of contemporary Europeans noting this. And they were also, I mean, Indians would, they'd say, oh, well, we got to attack a fort, and some Indians would say, well, honestly, I don't like my odds of attacking that fort, so I'm just not going to do it. And I think that some of it probably rubbed off, at least to some extent. We do know that certain of the guerrilla tactics and stuff were adopted by the Americans in the Revolution, and also to a lesser extent in the French and Indian War, if not in the conflicts, the innumerable intersocietal conflicts that happened all through that period. So there's that, and then just the environment. It's a different, North America is not England. It's a different set of circumstances. It's a different geography. I don't know why or if the geography itself would lend all that much to being libertarian, other than because of the greater size, there is the possibility that you'll have, how do I say this, more opportunity for individualism, let's just say that, which I think is still the case. I think if you look at the population density of the United States is still, I think, less than it would be in, say, England in 1750. I might be wrong about that, but it's certainly a possibility. So I don't think that there's a scientific way to prove most of this. If anyone's aware, Mr. Kemian, if you can point me out to the genetic things, I'd like to see it. there have been over the centuries a number of anecdotal observations that point to this. I remember when the Titanic sank. I don't remember like it happened to me, but they did. That was a big deal, obviously, and there was a great deal of study into that event. And I guess one of the things that was noticed was that a much higher proportion of Americans survived than British. And this was noticed, and people looked into it, and they asked the survivors, and what they basically said was that the the British passengers would get in line for a lifeboat. They'd queue up, and that's another thing. Is that the term? That's queue up. The English have this term for getting in a line and waiting your turn. That's not even a term in American English. I didn't know what it was for years. Anyway, they'd get in line and wait to get on the boat. And the Americans don't wait in line to get on the boat. They do whatever they can to get on the boat, and their survival rates reflect that. That's one example. There are probably quite a few others. I know if you ever watched the movie Last of the Mohicans, they're trying to get the British are trying to get the militia to come join them in the fight against the British, and the colonists are like, well, honestly, we don't want to leave our farms. What if the French attack our farms? What if the Indians attack our farms? What if I really don't give a shit? I'd rather grow my crops. And he has to negotiate and promise, well, if you get attacked, I'll let you go. And the Duncan, the kind of quasi-antagonist British guy, just says he can't believe it, because if the government of England needs to go to war, then they have to give their labor. They don't have to negotiate. That they're owed, whatever the king says, that's what they're supposed to do. And he couldn't believe that they would have to, ask and try and convince them that it was in their interest. Who cares if their farms get destroyed? So what? King and country, you got to do what they say. And General Webb is like, no, it's just the way it is here. They're not going to do it if you can't. You can't coerce them to do it. And this, there's another good book. It's called 1675: The Year America Lost Independence, and it talks about mostly the surrounding King Philip's War and Bacon's Rebellion, but how even though 1675, that's less than 70 years after the initial founding of Jamestown, 50 years after the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and or even less than that for Massachusetts Bay, 50 years since Plymouth. The colonists didn't want to be. There's one story where there was a tax collector. He was in Boston. He noticed them the merchants were dealing in something that was supposed to pay a heavy tax to the crown, and he said, hey, the law is you're supposed to pay a tax on that. And they're like, oh, fuck that. And he said, no, you're really supposed to pay a tax on that. So they tarred and feathered him. And it's in that, they used to do that a lot, apparently. We always hear about tar and feathering, and that's basically what would happen if the tax collector said, well, you got to pay this tax. And usually the tax collectors weren't lying. They weren't making up a tax for their own personal, a graft. They'd get tarred and feathered and run out of town, or maybe even worse. And even today, I know people who aren't libertarians at all. They think I'm a wacky, crazy libertarian, but they've got a whole bunch of guns, and they'll be striving. One told me that if the government comes to take his guns, they can have them, but he's going to die on a hill of brass. He's not going to just hand them over, or not even gun rights. I have relatives who aren't libertarians, and they'll be like, I have an uncle who's got a rifle, a Winchester repeating rifle. He never shoots. He doesn't hunt with it. Never practices with it. Somebody gave it to him 20 years ago, and I said, "What's that for?" And he goes, "That's when that's when the army guys are coming down the street. That's the last thing I'm going to hold for the 25 seconds before I'm killed." And it was kind of in jest, but only only a little bit. He seriously. thought that, hey, at some point that's what you're supposed to do. If you don't have a choice. And I don't know how common that is other places. There seems to be a real taboo. I mean, even talking to Europeans, they get real cautious even about self-defense against just a regular criminal. Like, that's okay. Maybe if you want to have a gun and do target shooting and you keep it locked up at the sheriff's department, maybe. But to shoot a criminal who was attacking you, oh no, that's going too far. To rebel against your state, or to even not active rebellion, just to not submit, that's downright antisocial. You deserve to have, to get whatever happens to you then. So yeah, there's definitely differences. Like I said, I can't really quantify them or qualify them, but they're definitely there. And I would be interested. I mean, the only genetic things I've heard about Americans is that they're taller. Americans have been the tallest people in the world since the late 1800s, the 1880s at least, up until very, very, very recently, as in last year. I think the Dutch overtook them. But honestly, I think that's because 30 million Mexicans have moved to America, not because the Anglo-Americans have gotten any shorter. And that has a lot to do with health, which is another thing. Americans have basically had the highest standard of living since at some point in the 18th century. We might say England was a richer country. The United States didn't surpass England in terms of industrial output until the 1870s, but the average American had more meat, had better food, had a better diet, had a better lifestyle, going way back. At least, I mean, I would say probably almost to the turn to like 1700. I'm not sure. I know by the mid 1700s that was the case. If you go back much further into the 1600s, you have the problems with the Indians wiping off half the colony, and you did have some famine very, very early on, and certain. Well, there have been epidemics up until about the 1900s, but I don't know how much that would have anything to do with it. Maybe when you're really healthy, you can afford to be more libertarian. But I'm not sure, and I'm not sure that's the only thing. Interesting, though, the people who were the tallest people prior to the Americans were actually the Lakota Sioux. And that's a lot of anthropologists found that really interesting, because height, even though it's a very rough, rude rubric, is usually considered one of the best overall indicators of health. If you're very sickly, it's unlikely that you'll grow to be very tall, especially based on the nutrition when you're really young, before 5, and to a lesser extent before puberty. So somehow the Lakota had pretty decent nutrition. I don't know if it's all the buffalo meat or what. But then Americans became the tallest people in the late 1800s, up until, I think, really till now. Officially the Dutch are taller, but there's a lot of Dutch people in America too. So I don't know if that really is that related or not, but there do seem to be differences, and I hope they're not genetic, because then I have to change my plans and start having more kids than I'm thinking about having right now. But maybe that's it. I mean, I was just watching Doug Casey the other day, and he was just thinking, based on the fact that some people just really go for it really easily, and other people, no matter how hard you try, it just never seems to work. Maybe there is some kind of genetic basis or reason, certain type of person that's more amenable to it than I. I hope that's not the case. If it is, then we got to go through the whole concentrate ourselves in one spot location. Of course, then we'll just get nuked, and humanity will have been denied its one true hope. But I'm not sure that's it, because I recently, especially, I've noticed a lot of people who became libertarians who were of a different stock altogether. It seems like, not always reading, not the most analytical. Just hey, it made sense, and so they went for it. So. Wow, this is a long video. I hope this lets me upload this. If it doesn't, I'll have to break it up. Bye. But all right, that's it.